Look at this one. The Navy sent us a librarian to teach survival. You think a storm scares us? We eat storms for breakfast. Get back inside, ma'am. Before you break a nail, the crowd of BUD/S candidates, young men carved from stone and ambition, chuckled nervously. They stood on the precipice of Hell Week, and the man speaking was Gunnery Sergeant Rourke, a Marine instructor whose voice sounded like rock slide and whose presence filled the entire concrete staging area. He was a monument to belligerent confidence, a caricature of the very warrior ethos he was meant to instill. His target was a small woman standing near the door, checking the straps on a simple olive drab pack. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. The rain, which had been a persistent drizzle all morning, was beginning to lash sideways, driven by a wind that moaned through the Quonset huts of Coronado. The sky over the Pacific had turned a bruised purple, a violent omen that the weather reports had tragically underestimated. But when Admiral Hayes, watching from the second-story window of the command building, saw her stance, the precise, economical way she tested the tension of a strap, the calm set of her shoulders against the rising gale, he felt a cold prickle of recognition he couldn't quite place. If you believe that true strength is measured not in words but in deeds, type competence below. The woman, Anya Sharma, simply cinched the final buckle on her pack. The click was barely audible over the wind, yet in the charged atmosphere, it sounded as final as a chambered round. She gave Rourke no acknowledgement, her focus entirely on the task at hand, a portrait of professional silence that the gunnery sergeant took for weakness, for fear. He saw her slight frame, the threads of silver in her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the unassuming lack of rank or insignia on her fatigues, and his assumptions calcified into scorn. He was building a theater of toughness for his candidates, and she was an inconvenient prop. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he boomed, stepping closer. "This is my house, my trainees. We don't need lectures on safety protocols from a civilian contractor. We need grit. You see this storm? This is a gift. It weeds out the weak." He gestured dismissively toward the churning ocean. "This is where SEALs are born, not in a classroom." Anya finally looked up, her gaze steady and unreadable. It wasn't defiant, nor was it submissive. It was simply observant, like a cartographer studying a new and interesting piece of terrain. "The arroyos will flash flood within the hour, Gunny. The terrain is unstable. Your planned route takes them through 3 potential kill zones." Her voice was low, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion, a statement of fact, not an argument. This placid delivery only enraged Rourke further. It was a rejection of his entire performance. "I'll tell you what's a kill zone," he snarled, getting inches from her face. "Doubting my orders in front of my men. You want to observe? Fine. Observe from out here." With a nod to the senior candidate, he gave his final, fateful command. "Lock it up. We're moving out." Let the expert enjoy the weather. The heavy steel door of the ready room swung shut, and with a resounding thud, the bolt was thrown. The laughter from inside was swallowed by the storm. Anya Sharma was left alone on the concrete, the full fury of the Pacific gale descending upon her. She didn't move. She just pulled up her hood, turned her face toward the violent sea, and waited. The world outside the ready room dissolved into a primal chaos of wind and water. Rourke's theatrical bravado lasted for approximately 30 minutes, the time it took for the storm to strip away the illusion of control and reveal the raw, indifferent power of nature. The lights in the facility flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into a disorienting gloom illuminated only by the strobing flashes of lightning outside. The backup generator failed to kick in. Then the comms went down. Rourke's booming voice, once a tool of intimidation, became tight with a rising panic he desperately tried to conceal. "Standard procedure," he barked into the darkness, his words lacking their earlier conviction. "Hold tight. System reboot," but the systems weren't rebooting. Outside, the roar was no longer just wind. It was the sound of the ocean trying to reclaim the land, of tons of water moving with terrifying force. A young candidate, pale-faced, managed to get a signal on a handheld radio for a brief moment. Sir, Alpha Team is not responding. Their last check-in was from the estuary quadrant. That whole area it's gone, sir. It's underwater, the blood drained from Rourke's face. The estuary quadrant, the very area Sharma had warned him about, one of the 3 kill zones she had identified with such unnerving calm. His arrogance had not just been foolish, it had been potentially lethal. He had sent 6 young men, his men, into a death trap he had been explicitly warned about, all to prove a point to a woman he had already dismissed. The weight of his failure was a physical thing, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He was a gunnery sergeant of the United States Marine Corps, a warrior, a leader, and in that moment, staring into the terrified eyes of his remaining trainees, he was utterly and completely lost. His authority, built on a foundation of volume and scorn, crumbled into dust. He had no power, no communications, no plan. He had only the roaring darkness and the sickening certainty that he had led his men to their doom. The gift of the storm, as he had called it, was now a curse, and it was a curse of his own making. While his world unraveled in the dark, Anya Sharma moved with a purpose that bordered on serene. The storm was not an adversary. It was a condition. The wind was a current to be navigated, the rain a veil to be pierced. She had not been left behind. She had been released. Free from the confines of the base and its politics, she moved through the deluge with a practiced, almost supernatural grace. Her feet found purchase on ground that had turned to slick mud, her internal compass unerring in the whiteout conditions. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was a part of it. She flowed through the chaos, a silent, methodical force of pure competence. The equipment Rourke had mocked was her arsenal. The simple analog compass, the waterproofed map, the length of high-tensile rope in her pack. These were the tools of a master craftsman. She reached the edge of the estuary, now a raging brown torrent where there had once been a gentle creek. On the far side, huddled on a rapidly shrinking island of high ground, were the 6 missing candidates of Alpha Team. One was down, his leg clearly broken at an unnatural angle. They were trapped, terrified, and succumbing to hypothermia. Anya didn't shout. She didn't wave. She simply went to work. With hands that were steady and sure, she anchored her rope to a sturdy outcrop of rock. She tied a series of complex knots, each one perfect, each one seated with a firm tug. Then, producing a small, powerful grappling hook from her pack, she gauged the wind and the current. She swung at once, twice, a smooth, powerful rotation, and let it fly. It soared across the churning water, a thin, dark line against the gray fury, and landed perfectly, its tines biting deep into the root system of a cypress tree on the other side. She tested the line, pulled it taut, and then, impossibly, began to cross hand over hand, suspended above the deadly floodwaters. It was a display of strength and technique that defied her slight build, a testament to a lifetime of discipline etched into her very muscle memory. She was not just a survivor. She was a master of this unforgiving environment. And as she reached the other side and began to triage the injured man's leg with cold, efficient precision, she pulled a small, sealed device from her vest. It was a personal locator beacon, a piece of gear Rourke had specifically ridiculed as a toy for people who planned to get lost. She broke the seal, pressed the activation button, and a tiny green light began to blink, a fragile pulse of hope in the heart of the maelstrom. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't care. She had done her job. Now, she would get these boys home. The signal from Sharma's beacon cut through the electronic chaos like a scalpel. In the base command center, a single, insistent chirp pierced the static-filled silence. A young ensign, his face etched with worry, stared at his screen in disbelief. "Admiral, I have a signal," he stammered, his voice cracking. "It's a civilian PLB, registered to an Anya Sharma. Signal is strong. Location: Sector Gamma 7, right on the edge of the estuary flood zone." Admiral Hayes, who had been pacing the room like a caged tiger, froze. The name, Sharma, connected with the flicker of recognition he'd felt earlier. It wasn't just a name. It was a key, unlocking a memory from a dark, classified corner of his past. A mission in the Hindu Kush, a ghost operative who moved through enemy territory unseen, unheard, leaving only whispers and results. A call sign, Wraith. He strode to the console, his face a mask of grim intensity. "Give me a visual," he commanded. "Drone, satellite, anything you can get through this weather." The ensign's fingers flew across the keyboard, but the storm was too thick. The screen showed nothing but swirling gray noise. The beacon was their only link to the people out there in the deluge. Rourke, who had been brought to the command center, stood by uselessly, a ghost at the feast of his own failure. He heard the name and the location and felt a fresh wave of shame. "That's impossible," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. That's where Alpha Team is. That's not possible." His mind couldn't reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming woman he'd left on the doorstep with the reality of a distress signal coming from the heart of the disaster zone. Just as the Admiral was about to order a high-risk helicopter insertion, the heavy doors to the command center burst open, admitting a blast of wind, rain, and six figures that seemed to be carved from the storm itself. They were clad in cutting-edge combat gear, their weapons held at a low ready, their movements fluid and predatory. They were SEALs, but not just any SEALs. Their gear, their bearing, the quiet, lethal intensity in their eyes. This was Team 6, DevGru. They were the tip of the spear, the President's own private army, and they were not supposed to be here. Their leader, a lieutenant commander with ice-blue eyes and a jaw set like granite, strode directly to Admiral Hayes, ignoring everyone else in the room. He didn't salute. He didn't ask. He stated, "Admiral, we picked up Wraith's beacon. We're going in." The use of the call sign, spoken with such casual, urgent authority, confirmed Hayes' suspicion. The pieces clicked into place. The quiet instructor, the impossible beacon, the sudden appearance of the nation's most elite warriors. It all made a terrifying kind of sense. Rourke, utterly bewildered, finally found his voice. "Who the hell is Wraith?" he demanded, his confusion overriding his shame for a moment. "Who is Sharma?" Admiral Hayes turned slowly, his eyes boring into the gunnery sergeant. The look on his face was not one of anger, but of a deep, profound disappointment that was far worse. He gestured to the ensign. "Pull up the service jacket from Master Chief Petty Officer Anya Sharma, retired," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. The ensign typed, and a file appeared on the main screen, illuminating the darkened room. Rourke's eyes widened in horror as he read. The screen was a litany of impossible achievements, a biography of a ghost. Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Medals, Navy Cross. Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters. The Purple Heart. Combat hours, classified. Mission classifications, redacted. 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 A long list of operations so secret they couldn't even be named, only hinted at by blacked-out paragraphs. "You asked who she is, Gunny," Admiral Hayes said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "She is the woman who wrote the book on extreme environment survival that your own Marine Corps uses at Quantico. She is the operator they sent into places so hostile that a team was considered too loud. She spent 18 months alone behind enemy lines with nothing but a knife and the gear in her pack. They don't call her Wraith because it's a cool name. They call her that because for most of her career, the only proof she even existed was the mission getting done." The DevGru lieutenant commander nodded grimly. "She trained half my team. We owe her our lives. We're getting her back." He and his men turned and melted back into the storm, leaving a stunned, cavernous silence in their wake. Rourke could only stare at the screen, at the face of the woman he had called a librarian, and grapple with the colossal, soul-crushing scale of his own ignorance. An hour later, the members of DevGru returned. They moved with the same silent efficiency with which they had departed, emerging from the storm not as conquerors, but as somber professionals who had completed a difficult task. They supported the 6 shivering, exhausted candidates of Alpha Team, guiding them toward the waiting medics. The injured recruit was on a stretcher, his leg expertly splinted, his pain managed. Behind them all, walking under her own power, was Anya Sharma. She looked weary, her face smudged with mud, her clothes soaked through, but her posture was still erect, her eyes still clear and observant. She carried her pack as if it weighed nothing, a simple tool she had just finished using. The command center had emptied onto the rain-slicked tarmac, the entire chain of command present to witness the outcome. Rourke stood at the edge of the crowd, a man hollowed out by his own folly. The DevGru lieutenant commander guided his men past the admiral, past the medics, and stopped directly in front of Anya. The entire base held its breath. In the pouring rain, under the harsh glare of the emergency floodlights, the leader of America's most elite special operations unit, a warrior who answered only to the highest levels of command, drew himself to attention. He executed a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. "Good to see you, Master Chief," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. One by one, the other 5 members of his team, legends in their own right, followed suit, their salutes a silent, powerful testament to the woman standing before them. The BUD/S candidates, both those who had been rescued and those who had watched from the ready room, stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes. They were witnessing a violation of the natural order of things, an inversion of the hierarchy they understood. A quiet, middle-aged female instructor was being saluted by the most dangerous men on the planet. The story began to spread before anyone had even spoken a full sentence. It moved through the ranks like a shockwave, transmitted in hushed whispers and disbelieving glances. The tale of the gunnery sergeant who had mocked the librarian, who had locked her out in the storm only to have her save his men and call down the ghosts of DevGru. It was too perfect, too cinematic to be real, and yet everyone had seen it. Rourke felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him. He didn't see scorn or pity in them. He saw something far worse, a lesson being learned at his expense. He was no longer a fearsome instructor. He was a cautionary tale. He had built his identity on a foundation of perceived strength, of loud dominance, and physical intimidation. In a single afternoon, that foundation had been obliterated by a quiet competence so profound it operated on a level he couldn't even comprehend. His arrogance had not been a sign of strength, but a symptom of a deep and abiding weakness, the inability to recognize true expertise when it stood right in front of him. He watched as Anya simply gave a small, tired nod to the SEALs, a gesture of mutual, unspoken respect between peers. There was no gloating in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet concern as she walked over to the recruits she had just saved, checking on the injured man and speaking in a low, reassuring voice to another who was clearly in shock. She was a professional. The mission was over. Now it was about the men, and in that simple, humble act, Rourke finally understood. He hadn't been humbled by a SEAL team, or an admiral, or a storm. He had been humbled by a standard he had failed to meet. Days later, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible blue and a base forever changed. The legend of Sharma's storm was already institutional folklore. Gunnery Sergeant Rourke was a different man. The bluster was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful humility. He approached Anya as she was cleaning her gear, her movements as methodical and precise as they had been on the day of the storm. He stood before her for a long moment, struggling for words. The apology he had rehearsed felt flimsy, inadequate. Finally, he spoke, his voice stripped of all its former gravelly arrogance. "Master Chief," he began, the honorific tasting strange and foreign, yet absolutely correct. "I was wrong. I was arrogant, and I was stupid. I put my men at risk to protect my own ego. There's no excuse. You saved them. I failed them." It was a stark, brutal confession, and it cost him everything. Anya looked up from the rifle she was cleaning, her hands never ceasing their rhythmic, practiced motions. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not an unreadable calm, but a flicker of something else. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. "You made a mistake based on a bad assumption, Gunny," she said, her voice even. "The unforgivable mistake is not learning from it. Your men are watching you now. They're not watching to see if you're tough. They're watching to see if you're wise. She finished reassembling the bolt of her rifle with a final, satisfying click. They're good kids. They're strong. They'll be better for this. Make sure you are, too. She offered no absolution, no easy forgiveness. She offered something far more valuable, a path forward, a challenge to be better. It was the most profound lesson he had ever received, delivered not in a shout, but in a quiet conversation over a cleaning mat. He simply nodded, the two words, "Thank you, Master Chief," feeling like the most honest he had ever spoken. He turned and walked away, not a broken man, but a man being rebuilt on a new, more solid foundation. The physical landscape of the training area also bore a permanent scar from that day. The ravine where Anya had rigged her impossible highline to save Alpha Team had been carved deeper by the flood. The recruits, on their own initiative, had started calling it Sharma's Crossing. The name stuck. It became a landmark on their navigation exercises, a point of reference both geographical and moral. To pass Sharma's Crossing was to be reminded of the difference between loud confidence and quiet competence. It was a reminder that the most dangerous person on the battlefield is not always the one who makes the most noise. One morning, the recruits found something new there. A small, unassuming brass plaque had been bolted to the rock face where Anya had anchored her rope. There was no official ceremony, no announcement. It had simply appeared overnight. The plaque bore no name, no date, no explanation. It contained only a single word, etched in stark, simple lettering, Wraith. It was a quiet tribute from the shadows, a mark of respect from one ghost to another, a permanent testament to the quiet professional who had turned a storm into a classroom and a near disaster into an enduring lesson in humility and strength. Months bled into a year. The seasons turned over the Coronado coast, but the story of Anya Sharma became a permanent fixture, a foundational myth for every new class of hopefuls who arrived to test their mettle against the grinding crucible of BUD/S. The tale was told not to Leonize one person, but to teach a fundamental truth of the world they sought to enter. It was told by new instructors, including a transformed gunnery Sergeant Rourke, whose teaching style was now defined by a quiet intensity and a deep respect for the hidden strengths of the men under his charge. He would stand with the trainees at Sharma's Crossing, point to the small brass plaque, and speak not of her superhuman skill, but of her unshakable professionalism. He spoke of her calm in the face of his own foolishness, her focus on the mission over the ego, her absolute commitment to the standard. The story was no longer about his humiliation, but about his education. Anya herself was rarely seen. She had finished her contract as an instructor and moved on, fading back into the quiet, unassuming life she preferred. Some said she was consulting at a private level, others that she had simply retired to a cabin somewhere in the mountains. The truth didn't matter. Her presence was felt more keenly in her absence. She had become a symbol, a ghost in the machine of naval special warfare. Her legacy wasn't in the medals locked away in a box somewhere, or in the redacted lines of her service file. It was in the steady hands of a young SEAL rigging a line in a gale force wind. It was in the quiet confidence of a team leader trusting the expertise of a subordinate, regardless of their rank or appearance. It was in the humility of a powerful man admitting he was wrong. Her actions on that day had created a ripple effect, subtly but irrevocably altering the culture of the institution she had served so faithfully. She had proven, in the most dramatic way imaginable, that respect is not a function of rank or gender or volume. It is the final, inevitable echo of demonstrated, undeniable competence. True authority is not taken. It is granted by those who recognize in you a mastery they aspire to. Anya Sharma never sought respect, and so she had earned it in its purest form. She had shown them all that the most powerful force in the world is not the storm, but the quiet, steady hand that knows how to navigate it. Her silence had become the loudest lesson the base had ever learned. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.